If you were able to see our video this past week, we talked about, or I kind of set up this weekend's message for us. It just seems like in society and culture right now, it seems like everything is at a heightened level. It seems like it's really easy to call people names. It's really easy to group people in a certain group of people. Instead of really getting past that and really starting to have conversations, it's like we're always just on the surface. And I also talked about how I really believe that this weekend, whether you're in the room, in person or online, that what we're going to talk about can cause a lot of tension. There's going to be a lot of tension in the air. We all, I think, deal with this question. And I think the underlying problem, the underlying issue, the underlying thing that we're dealing with in society and culture is this very specific question that we're dealing with this weekend in our I Am series. And the question is, who's going to love me? See, I believe I think underneath of everything is this very question. For instance, we're in the midst of March Madness. Now, for those of you that aren't sports fans, specifically basketball fans, you're maybe not even aware of what March Madness is. But March Madness is this basketball tournament that is just, it's at the height of everything we see in the sports world right now. One of the teams, Ohio State, was considered to be a team that possibly could win the national championship. But they ended up losing to a team that was seeded lower than them, that wasn't expected to do very much, but Ohio State beat them. And the story came out that as soon as those players, no sooner did they leave the court after losing this game that they were supposed to win, that they were receiving texts, and social media was blowing up. And even some of the players were even received death threats. So I think, I don't know if they were actually asking this question out loud, but here's the thing. It boils down to that these young men are asking the question, who's going to love them? April 1st, we are about to celebrate, again, staying on the sports theme. April 1st is opening day for baseball. Several years ago, the Chicago Cubs in the postseason. If you've been to a baseball game, a lot of us, we take our baseball glove and we dream of catching a foul ball, or even better yet, even a home run. And several years ago, that wasn't any different for a fan of the Cubs. And on top of that, it's postseason. And so often, if you've seen anything about baseball on TV, you'll see a lot of times a fan will reach out, even on a foul ball, will reach out over to catch the ball. And a fan, specifically a Cubs fan, reached out to a pop fly that would have ended the game. And it just so happens that one of the Cub ball players should have been able to catch the ball, but a fan reached out and caught the ball before that player could. And it changed the whole trajectory of that game and a postseason that year for the Cubs. That guy's life was never the same again. So the question is, who's going to love me? Or if you are a fan of The Bachelor, or know what the show of The Bachelor, then the young lady who eventually won the final rose and even became engaged to the young man on The Bachelor, some recent information, some recent details of her past, this young lady's past came out that offended everyone. So therefore, this couple ended up breaking off the engagement. This young lady has to ask, who's going to love me? Or what about the 76-year-old grandmother who's struggling with memory? And she doesn't know what's happening, and she knows what's happening because she's been down that path, that very path before with her mom. She's asking the question, who's going to love me? What about the 44-year-old husband who has watched his wife just die of COVID? And he lays lonely in his bed and can't even bring himself to sleep in the middle of it because he knows that vacant space beside him still belongs to the woman of his dreams. And as he stares up into the ceiling, asking the question, who's going to love me? What about the grandparent that receives the news that their grandson has been killed in a car accident? Who's going to love me? Or what about the parent that comes home to find their oldest child has committed suicide? Who's going to love me? What about the pastor who's struggling and lonely, wondering who's going to love me? What about the young teen struggling with their own sexuality, asking the question, who's going to love me? Or the mom who's just experienced a miscarriage, asking the question, who's going to love me? Or the couple who's been trying to have children, and they're asking the question, who's going to love me? You see, I believe everything leads back to this question, who's going to love me? But here's the thing. It is real easy to look at other people. It's real easy to label people. It's real easy to call people names. It's real easy to take a group of people and say that you're this, or to take a person and say this, or to look at someone and their past mistakes, or whatever they've done in life, and to label them that. Instead of going beyond that label, instead of going beyond putting people in a group in a certain way, and really getting to going beneath that. Where I believe it all stems from, this whole idea that people are just crying out, they're asking, who's going to love me? Where I'm at in life right now, where I'm at, who's going to love me? You see, Jesus knows that longing to be loved. Over in John chapter 10, the setting comes right on the heels of a man who was born blind. Talking about being labeled, even here in Scripture, we don't even know this gentleman's name. Well, how do we know him? We know him as the blind man. But Jesus has just healed this man that was born blind. And after he's healed, the religious leaders are actually questioning the integrity of this young man. They're questioning his integrity. They're asking, aren't you the one that was born blind? How can this be? And they're trying to shoot holes. They're trying to discredit what is actually taking place. Instead of celebrating this miracle, instead of getting excited about what is actually, who cares how it happened? Instead of just celebrating and embracing this exciting thing that's taking place in this man's life, they're trying to beat it up. Until finally we see that he is thrown out. Eventually they just throw him out. See, the opposite from these leaders is what we see from Jesus. The opposite is what we see from these religious leaders. They have a different agenda than Jesus, the great I am. So here in John chapter 10, Jesus shares the contrast between those who love people and those who love power. And I think that is our struggle that's going on. If we really get to the gist of it, that's the struggle that we're seeing in our culture today. Those that are willing to love people versus those that have this love for power. See, to convey his point, Jesus chooses an analogy that specifically during the culture during this time, people would have been able to relate to. For us, it's harder today to understand this idea of a shepherd and sheep. But to the people that Jesus is talking to at this time, they would have really understood. They would have known. In fact, specifically for the Jews, their mind was already set upon. They looked at anybody that held any position of leadership as a shepherd, whether it be spiritual or political. They considered him to be a shepherd. And Israel was at the privilege of all this because specifically, even if you look at Psalms 100, Psalms 100 verse 3 says, Israel is considered the flock of the Lord. So in this culture, again, everyone could relate to Jesus' analogy that he chooses to share. You see, Jesus begins talking about the difference between the ones who loves his sheep and the thief who wants to steal the sheep. Look with me at John chapter 10, verses 1 and 3. This is what we see. Jesus, he says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep's pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. Now, why is this so important? Well, there's more than just being a shepherd. Jesus is sharing that then there's more than just herding sheep. In other words, here it is, there's the relationship. There is a real personal approach to being a good shepherd. Now, how could sheep tell the difference in the shepherd? Well, for two ways. First, every shepherd had a distinct earmark, which he cuts into the ear of the sheep. And this would help so that even at a distance, it was easy to determine who the sheep belonged to. Now, the second way is by how the sheep would respond to the shepherd's voice. Looking on at verse 3 and 4, it says, he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. See, in the morning, each shepherd would come and call their sheep and assemble their own flocks together. He knew them, and they knew him. Now, if a dishonest shepherd came in and tried to get the sheep to follow him, they wouldn't budge. The false shepherd can never lead the sheep because they won't respond to their voice. So what do they have to do then? They end up having to steal the sheep. That's why the good shepherd would lead the sheep instead of just driving the sheep. But a good shepherd goes beyond just knowing them. See, I've read that sheep are about the only animals which has no defense mechanism. Think about that. They can't run fast. They have no way to harm a predator. They have no fierce growl, if you will, no way of scaring that predator. In other words, they need protection. They need protection. So through time, they develop a friendship, they develop this relationship, they develop this trust between the shepherd and the sheep. And the shepherd will protect the sheep. Verses 12 and 13 says, the hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So he sees the wolf coming, and he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. In other words, why should I risk my neck for these sheep? They're not mine. But the good shepherd doesn't run from danger. The good shepherd does the opposite. It runs toward the threat. See, this concept of a divine shepherd goes back all the way back to Psalms 23. Centuries before Jesus. The psalmist wrote from the perspective, again, of the sheep and said, the Lord is my shepherd, and thy rod and thy staff, they will comfort me. See, the comfort comes from knowing, from this idea of protection that the shepherd provides. And protection can come in other ways as well. The sheep are pestered by something called nose flies. So the name comes from the fact that the fly will land on the soft membrane of sheep's nose and deposit eggs that would eventually hatch there. And it would drive the sheep crazy. So when the shepherd saw the sheep acting crazy, he would put special oil on the sheep and repel the fly to protect them. That's why David, he wrote, and you anoint my head with oil. See, even David, being a shepherd himself, he knew that a good shepherd, that it was all about not just the relationship, but also protecting the sheep. In the evenings, when sheep are led into the sheep pen, a shepherd will lay at what was considered the door of the entrance to protect the sheep. Ezekiel 34, verse 12, and even part of verse 16 says, as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock, when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. Goes on to say, I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. And see, I know some of you, as soon as I read that, as soon as as you're thinking through this, you're saying, but wait a minute, where is the Good Shepherd now? I needed the Good Shepherd's protection. I need the relationship. But where's he at? Where's he been for me? What about my loneliness? I need the relationship. And what about my loneliness? What about my financial struggles? What about me losing my job? What about the fact that I didn't set aside enough for retirement, so I had to go back to work and get a job, part-time job? What about my spouse who we just found out has cancer? Or what about this whole thing dealing with COVID and my family member that has COVID, or my spouse that has COVID? Where is the Good Shepherd now? Where is he at? Write this down in your notes. Jesus isn't protection from the storm, but he promises to be the protection in the storm. See, when we talk about this relationship with God through Jesus Christ, somehow within the church, we've got this distorted, and it's really distorted outside the church walls. It's the fact that when you surrender your life to Christ, when you become a follower of Christ, that everything is supposed to be good, that everything's supposed to be just right, that you're never supposed to lose your job. Your car's never supposed to break down. You're never supposed to hear something bad from the doctor. And that is not true. And I don't know where that came about, but down through, culturally, through the church, that it is spread, and we painted this picture that everything is just all hunky-dory. And the truth is, it's not all hunky-dory. A lot of people are broken and messed up for you, for me. But a lot of people outside the walls of the church don't understand that, because we portray this persona, this idea that life is good, but life is okay. You follow Christ, there's no problems. That's not the case. In fact, we've even created this myth of this idea that Jesus won't allow us to go through or experience more than we can handle. And that's not true. That's not biblical. That's not what Jesus said. Think about that. Say that out loud. Say that out loud. Say that Jesus won't allow us or won't let us go through or experience more than we can handle. What are we saying? Listen to our words. We're saying that, therefore, we don't need Jesus. And Jesus won't allow us to go through or experience more than we can handle. I don't know about you, but I know for me that I've experienced some things in my life that there's no way I can handle them. But I was able to get through them. Why? Because of Jesus. Because of my relationship with God through Jesus Christ. But if I didn't have that relationship, if Jesus didn't lead me through that, there's no way I could have made it through that. Verse 11 of John 10 says, I am the good shepherd. This is Jesus speaking. I am the good shepherd. I am. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, I am a good shepherd. He says, I am the good shepherd. You see, a good shepherd knows me. A good shepherd knows his sheep. A good shepherd has a relationship with his sheep. A good shepherd goes farther than just the relationship, the whole protection. But ultimately, here's the thing. Ultimately, proof that Jesus is the good shepherd, ultimate proof of the good shepherd is what Jesus says in verse 17 and 18. It says this. It says, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Think about this whole setting. For centuries, the blood of an innocent sheep or a lamb atone for the sins of the people. The great high priest, he would go in to the place of Holy of Holies and he would offer up this sacrifice, sheep or a lamb, on behalf of the people. But all this changed when Jesus walked amongst his creation. You see, in the Old Testament, the way it was done under the old covenant, the old way, the sheep sacrificed his life for the shepherd. But with Jesus, the time has finally come and is here where the shepherd laid down his life for the sheep. You see, Jesus laid down his life for you and for me. He laid down his life for our neighbors. He laid down his life for this community. He laid down his life for the 76-year-old who's been through that with her mom and knows what she's going through now in her memory loss. And she's asking the question, who's going to love me? Jesus saying, I love you. I love you. Those basketball players that are wondering when getting all those threats and all those text messages and all that, wondering, what's going on? This is just basketball, and kind of when their buttons is going, there's got to be more to life than this. They're wondering who's going to love me. Jesus says, I'll love you. The young adult that's struggling to figure out their sexuality, they're trying to figure it out. They're hearing all these different things, and we hear all these different things culturally, and all these distorted things and everything, and trying, in the midst of all this, the young adult, Jesus is saying, I love you. I love you. The young family that's struggling right now, that's struggling to figure it out, that wants so badly to love that child, but for whatever reason, they've not been able to experience that miracle yet, for whatever reason, and they're wondering why and all this. They're asking the question, who's going to love me? And Jesus says, I love you. I love you. You see, it all boils down. I really believe that what we're dealing with in society and culture today, it all boils down to that question. Who's going to love me? Who's going to love me? And people are trying to find these answers and trying to raise themselves up to points where they can get to the point where they will be loved, they will be accepted, and all these different things, and labels, and all these other things that mean absolutely nothing. And Jesus is saying to you, and he's saying to me, I love you. I love you. Who's going to love me? Who's going to love you? Who's going to love you? Who's going to love you? Who's going to love us?